Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the FSAI's Breakfast Bite on food labelling for food businesses, what you need to know. I'm Emma, and I'll be your host for the event this morning. We're delighted you're here online with us. I'm joined by my colleague Clodagh. Clodagh works in the area of food labelling. The event this morning will last 14 minutes. The presentation will last 30, followed by 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers. If you do have any questions for Clodagh, you can pop them in the chat box on your screen and we'll do our best to get to them at the end. Also, just to say thanks to everyone who submitted questions via the registration form when signing up. We'll look at those questions also. If you look in the handout section on your screen, you'll see that we've put together some labelling related handouts that you might find useful after the event. The handouts can also be downloaded if you like. And lastly, if you're on social media, please let us know at #FSAI events. And now I'll hand you over to Clodagh. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma, and good morning, everybody. You're very welcome along to the session this morning on food labelling. I suppose really food labelling is the subject that keeps everybody's interest because it pretty much covers such a range of, never mind the topics, but the food businesses for which it applies. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a small food business operator with just maybe, a small selection of foods that you produce, or whether it's a larger food business, or whether you're supplying into a catering establishment. The food labelling rules apply. So I have a slide deck that I'm going to go through, hopefully to be able to cover off some of the key labelling requirements. Obviously, it's not possible to get through all of it this morning, but as we go through, I'm going to turn off my camera now, but we do have a Q&A session, as Emma mentioned, at the end, so I'll come back on then and we can go through some of the questions. Okay, so if we take a look then at what I'm hoping to cover in the next little while, you can see there that we will be looking at So I'm going to have a look at the fundamental principles really about food labelling, and as I said, it covers all foods, whether it's pre-packaged for the final consumer or whether it's food going business to business sale. We want to look a little bit about the food business responsibilities, and again, this is really important so that you as food business operators will be aware of your obligations, and hopefully from today you'll be aware of those more so, and we'll be able to signpost you for further information. The key part of the presentation then will obviously be the information that must be on the label. So we'll go through some of the key points there. And then I'd like to just at the very end just look at some of the future proposals in terms of food labelling. And as I said, it is a very broad subject. There are so many parts to it, and there's always new parts to it as well. So if we take a look then in terms of what the piece of legislation is, it's Regulation 1169 of 2011. We refer to it as FIC, and you're probably more familiar with calling it FIC. It's quite a lengthy document for certainly and not such an easy read. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of pages in that particular piece of legislation. And I suppose the thing that makes it, a discussion point all the time is that there are so many exemptions and derogations to the rules. So we're going to look at what has to be on the label, but then there are also considerations as to, the exemptions. Certain things mightn't apply to certain foods. And I suppose I will say as well at this point is that when we consider food labelling, we must consider every piece of information on the label in its entirety, so that if we find that there's one piece of information that might be misleading or there mightn't be clear on the label, we must address anything else on the label that might tie in with that information. So to define food information or define under FIC, food information to consumers, the food information is concerning a food and made available to the final consumer, and that could be by the label, as we would typically see in the supermarket. It could be any other accompanying material, and also definition in the legislation covers any other means, including modern technology tools. And so what we're saying here then is that, as I said, the label will be the physical part on the food product that the consumer can read at the retail level or in the supermarket scenario. But this information also applies to any other promotional material, any other advertising material that you may use as a food business, and indeed any information you put on the website or social media. And I think that's a really key message for today, given the fact that the situation now with COVID, many food businesses are turning towards online sales or using their social media platforms to be able to promote their foods. But any information that you post on these would also fall subject to FIC. So that's just something to bear in mind. In terms of the fundamental principles, then we are looking at the key, I suppose, general points of fair information practices to the consumer, and that the information that you put on the label must be clear, it must be unambiguous, it must be legible and easy to understand, and that's a really key part. And the other part, obviously, for consumers here in Ireland, the information must be in English. Now, there are many other languages may be permitted on that label also, but that would be in addition to the English, and also bearing in mind that the FIC legislation also specifies a specific font size for which all of the mandatory information must be labelled. So if your label is going to be servicing a number of different markets, the label must be big enough to accommodate all of the mandatory information in all of the different languages. And the key thing in the middle there in green is that the consumer must not be misled. And this is a really big part of the legislation. It comes in under Article 7 of FIC. And there are a number of different ways the consumer could be misled, by way of various pieces of information on the label, by way of its composition of the food. It might be the actual colour scheme used on the labelling itself that might imply where the food may have come from. There are many different ways. And indeed, a lot of labels may be giving characteristics to their food product when in actual fact all other similar foods in the same category would have that same characteristic. So these are key things to remember under Article 7 of the regulation on FIC. In terms of the responsibilities of the food business operator, as I said, this is a key part for yourselves to know what your obligations are. So the responsibilities are under Article 8 of FIC, and basically it says that the food business responsible for the food information, so anything that goes on the label, is the responsibility of the food business operator under whose name or business name the food is marketed. And I think just to say here as well, even though this isn't a Brexit piece, just to say that the addition to this sentence is that if that operator is not established in the union, the importer into the union market business name and address must be on the label. So because of Brexit and because the UK have left the European Union since the 31st of December, a UK address alone is not considered compliant because it's no longer a name or business name of the food within the European Union. So in this case, there's actually then the requirement to have an importer's address on the label. So that's all I'm going to say about that, because I said that is coming under the Brexit rules, and there's a great amount of information in an FAQ under the Brexit section on our website should you need to get some more. In terms then of the responsibility of the food business operator, they must ensure the presence and accuracy of the information. So yes, all of the mandatory information must be on the label or must be on the other accompanying material, and it must be accurate. And as we said previously about the misleading, the information must be clear, unambiguous, and really easy for the consumer to understand. All of the information must be passed along the food chain to enable the food business, when required, to provide that information to the final consumer. So again, as I said, this is kind of looking more at the business to business sale, that if you're a producer and you're supplying your food into maybe a catering establishment or another establishment, it's your obligation to supply that information along the chain so that your customer will have the necessary information. So we'll take a look a little bit later about that when I bring a slide up on business to business sale. In terms then, let's move on to the information that must be on a label, and it's summarised here on this list of 11 points. Obviously, as I said, the labelling rules, they're so vast, there's so much to it. I can't go through all of it today, but what I have done is selected a few of the key points on this list of 11 to talk to you about. I'll just flag there numbers 1 and 4, so it's the name of the food and the net quantity, have the little asterisks after it. And so that means that that information must appear in the same field division on your label. So in other words, as a consumer, if I pick up your food product, I must be able to see those two pieces of information on the same surface under normal purchasing conditions. So I can see it clearly at one glance, as opposed to having to twist and turn the food product. Okay. So just to really, I suppose this is the list of the information that applies to the general labelling of all food products. What I do need to just flag here as well, and even though we won't go into the detail, is that there are a lot of other food commodities that have their own specific legislation that will have labeling provisions within those. So what I'm saying here is that if you are making, for example, jam or chocolate, or say it's a spirit drink, you will have to consider the rules under FIC, which is the general food labeling, but you will also then have to consider under that product specific legislation what other labeling provisions there are. And just to say that there's a full list of all of the legislation on our website should you need any more information on each of the different specific commodities. So here you'll see my list of 11 again, and I've highlighted the key ones in red. And these are the ones really I want to talk to you a little bit about today, because I suppose these are the ones that create probably more of the questions and the issues, okay? So if we look at ingredients, any food label, when it's a pre-packed food for the final consumer, must have an ingredients declaration, and that declaration must be a heading that includes the word ingredients. So you'll see a little example of a typical type of a label there. You can clearly see as a consumer ingredients. And now we start off and we can see that there's a whole long list of different ingredients there. And the legislation requires those ingredients to be listed in descending order of weight. So in other words, the largest ingredient down to the smallest ingredient as you use it in your recipe, or at the mixing bowl stage as it's called. The other key thing to say, and this really goes back to my earlier slide on not misleading the consumer, is that the ingredients must be labelled by their specific name. So for example, if I see here there's a tomato puree listed in as the second ingredient in this example here. But for example, if you were making a composite ready meal or a fine line food that has a number of different ingredients, if you were, for example, to use tomato ketchup as your ingredient, that is the name of the ingredient that must be on the label of the final food, and it shouldn't be reflected on the label as tomatoes. So it's really clear that this information is exactly as whatever ingredient you put into the food is the name of the ingredient you will label on your final food product. And just to also say that there's also, again, under the legislation, this is probably the first of the derogations that I'm going to talk to you about, is that there's also a very short list of foods that do not require a list of ingredients. So some of them examples there, fresh fruit and vegetables wouldn't need a list of ingredients, and even if it was a mixed bag of fruit and veg, unless they've been peeled, chopped, or further processed. So we see now typically a lot of the convenience packs of the mix of fruit and vegetables. If they're chopped up and peeled, well then that takes them out of this derogation. But if they're just the actual pieces of fruit and vegetables in a bag, untreated, uncut, they don't need the list of ingredients. There's other ones there, products that comprise a single ingredient, so that's clear, the name of the food indicates the ingredient. Alcoholic beverages greater than 1.2% alcohol, as a general rule, don't need to have a list of ingredients. Okay, so in terms of then to highlight some other key points, and is the allergens, so the allergenic ingredients that you may use in your food product. And again, this is really essential, and this is where we're getting into, I suppose, the safety element of the labeling of the food products, because if you use any of these known 14 allergens or category of ingredients, you must clearly identify them on the label. And you'll see there, I have two columns of the allergenic ingredients. You're probably all well familiar with these. You've got the likes of mustard, eggs, fish, peanuts. But the two on the top that are highlighted, the cereals containing wheat, because that's a category. You've got a number of different cereals. You've even got a number of different components or breakdown ingredients of wheat. And the nuts would be the tree nuts. So you'll see it there on the end of the screen that's popped up. Where you use either the cereals or the nuts, you must declare the actual name of the cereal and the actual name of the nut. It's not sufficient just to write the word cereal or nut, okay? And just in the case of the cereals, it is the gluten part that is it's the gluten within the cereals that will cause the allergen. But in this case, the labeling rules highlight the cereal contains gluten. So just use the word gluten on the label. Okay, so that's really important. They're the 14 allergenic ingredients. The list hasn't changed in a number of years. It could change. It will be up to you know, research and outcomes at European level to decide if there's any new additions to this list, or indeed if any of these ingredients will be taken off the list. But if that is to happen, it will be passed into the legislation, and that's something we'll be all made aware of. So just key to know that you have to be mindful of those 14 ingredients. How you declare the allergen information on the label, then you'll see again, using my same little example at the top, they're highlighted in such a way that you are emphasizing the name of the allergen in a typeset which clearly differentiates it from all other ingredients. Now, it seems to be the rule of thumb for industry is that it's using to bold the actual ingredient or allergenic ingredient name, but it can be done in any other form, maybe capital letters or a different color font size, font style. So just to bear that in mind, pre-packed foods, the ingredients declaration must highlight those particular allergenic ingredients. In the case of the food products, and I had a few on the list earlier of foods that are exempt from having to give a list of ingredients, in that case, you won't be able to highlight the allergen in the ingredients declaration. So you'll just use a contains and put down whatever it is. So in the example of perhaps of wine, it will now say contains sulfites, okay? And the sulfites, if they're greater than 10 parts per million, are considered allergenic. But in no other circumstance on a pre-packed label where there is a list of ingredients should you see the word contains separately from the list of ingredients. The additives then are another key point just to mention, and there's a whole other separate set of legislation that regulates the additives, the functionality, what foods they can be used in, and the levels that they can be used. But for the purposes of labeling, I just want to point out that in the ingredients declaration, you would need to identify the category of the additive first, so whether it's a color, preservative, thickener, and then it's followed by either the specific name of the additive or its E number. Okay, so you can see the example there, color S, green S or color E142. That's perfectly fine. It's up to you as the food industry to decide how you're going to present it. The other one there is flavor enhancer is the category. The name of it is monosodium glutamate, or you could then just present it as flavor enhancer E621. But going back to the conversation just previously on the last slide about the allergens, if your additive that you use has an allergenic component, so example here is sodium sulfite that's being used as a preservative, you in this case are not permitted just to give the E number. So you can see here you're giving the category as preservative and it'll be followed by sodium sulfite, and again you're highlighting the sulfite part to indicate that this is an allergen, so that any consumer that buys a food product that contains this preservative will be very clearly identified to the fact it contains an allergen. Moving on then to the date declaration on food labels, and then this is another key point. There's two different date markings, a best before and a use by. The best before really is a quality indicator. It's for non-perishable foods that would have a long shelf life, dried goods, tins, crackers, cereals, etc. A use by date, however, is a safety indicator, and this would be on foods that from a microbiological point of view, they're highly perishable and would be likely to cause illness after a short period of time if they were consumed. Okay, so this is really important to know the difference between the use by and the best before. The use by date will also be required then to follow up the date with a description of the storage instructions which must be observed. So in other words, if you take any typical chilled product in your fridge, it will have a use by date of whatever the date is, and then afterwards it'll say something on the lines of keep refrigerated or store between 0 and 4 degrees. So at least the consumer knows now how to store that food to maintain its safety once they've purchased the product. Again, looking at some of the exemptions, the following just examples of fresh fruit and vegetables, wine, chewing gum, beverages greater than 10% alcohol don't need to declare a date marking on the label. So that's just another one of the exemptions that's contained in the annex at the back of the legislation. So just the annex that I mentioned there is Annex 10 of FIC, and you'll see that that also gives you guidance on how you actually display the date. So as a food business operator, you will be required to determine, does your food product require to declare a use by date or a best before date? And to get to that point, you will have to have your product tested. You may just need to consider the characteristics internally of the food product. We have a guidance note on shelf life that covers all of this. To be able to help you identify and to be able to substantiate the date that you put on your label. But once you've arrived at the fact that you know that you must declare a use by date, Annex 10 then will tell you how you display it as day, month, and optionally the year, because these are very short products. So you can say 28th of February or 28th of March, and you use the term use by. Similarly, and again, as I said, afterwards you can have a look at the annex. For a best before date, there are kind of 3 different categories depending on how long your food will, I suppose, stay in the quality sector for. So you have less than 3 months or greater than 18 months. And again, there's individual ways as to how you would display the best before date. So something that has a best before of greater than 18 months, that's quite a long time away. It's sufficient to say, and again, remember you use your term best before, and then it's fine to say end 2021. So that means anything with that date on it is fine up to the last date of 2021. So just important to note that. What I'm going to do now is really move on to another aspect of the labelling legislation, which always creates another piece of conversation. But what I'd like to do here is just maybe launch a quick poll, just to really get your feedback on, just to have a look and see, you know, what do you think in terms of the origin labelling. So if I can just give you a few minutes there to see the answers are coming in there, in terms of whether you consider the origin labelling to be required as a general rule under the FIC. So I think pretty much it looks as if we've probably arrived. There's a few, still a tweak around in the results, but by and large we can see there that overall the poll is swinging more towards the true side. So what I'll do now is I'll just go back to the presentation to have a look. And I suppose really I just wanted to bring that poll in because, you know, as consumers ourselves, never mind the fact that we're looking at the legislation, often people consider that certain things should be on the food labelling. So that'll bring us on nicely to have a look at origin labelling. And as I said, most of the representation today was swinging towards the true answer. So in terms of origin labelling, Article 26 of FIC covers this, and really the 2 key messages in the Article 26 is that origin is required where the failure to indicate it might mislead the consumer. So what do we mean by this? And this is really going back to the very outset where we talked about misleading. And essentially, if you have a food product that doesn't have its own specific rules to give origin, so it's falling just generally under FIC, you are not required to give origin on that label unless the label might mislead. And there are a number of different ways that you might mislead the consumer. You might have some emblems, some flags, you might have a colour scheme on the particular label that you use that could allow the consumer to believe that that food product either came from somewhere that it didn't, or that it contains something that it doesn't. Maybe you might have a picture of an ingredient that actually isn't present within the food. So in terms of the origin for misleading, if you have any of those flags, those map, or any other information on there that could allow the consumer to believe the food came from somewhere, you're then prompted into having to give an origin declaration. The other key point under Article 26 is that the origin is required for fresh or frozen meat that fall within certain codes, and essentially that would be fresh or frozen meat from pigs, from sheep, from goats or poultry. And following on from FIC, we then had a piece of legislation, Regulation 1337 of 2013, and this brought in the rules for how you must declare the origin on the fresh and frozen pig, sheep, goat or poultry. So if you go to the supermarket as a consumer and you buy chicken fillets in a packet, you will now see an amount of information that relates to the origin of that that meat product. Just to say here as well that beef labelling has always, from back in 2000, due to BSE, etc., that would always have had a requirement that you give the origin for beef. And also other product-specific legislation, such as honey, for example, also has an indication requirement for origin on the label. So just to be mindful of that unless there's something on your label that could mislead the consumer, you're not obligated under the general rules to provide origin. But then if you are packing off the fresh cuts of the meat under Regulation 1337, you must give the origin details as per that legislation. And the other part to that is that the FIC rules introduced another requirement for origin labelling under Regulation 2018-775, and really this looks at the origin of the primary ingredient where that is different to the origin of the final food. So if we can imagine, if we had a ready meal, if we had say for example, origin of beef in lasagna, if we had a lasagna and on that label we had something like the little emblem here that says produced in Ireland with a little flag, what that's now telling the consumer, or the consumer, it's implying to the consumer, is that everything within that lasagna is also Irish, but beef may not be Irish. So if it's a case that the primary ingredient, which is defined as greater than 50% of the final food, or that's associated with the food, so in other words, the beef and the lasagna would be associated, you are obliged then under this particular legislation to give the origin also of the primary ingredient. And bear in mind that that origin must be presented in the same field division as the origin that you gave for the final lasagna. So if you do have that little symbol that says produced in Ireland on the front of your pack, and if your primary ingredient is not Irish, you must give the origin declaration of the primary ingredient as close on the same field division as your produced in Ireland symbol. So this rule came in, it applied from the 1st of April 2020. And sorry, 2019, I think I have an error there, but it's under regulation 2018-775, and that's one to really be mindful of because it incorporates anything on the label, and also if you make the statement produced in Ireland, that is bringing you then into this piece of legislation, and you then may have to give the origin of the primary ingredient. So plenty to think about in terms of the origin labelling. You know, sometimes it causes a little bit of confusion, but you can see clearly now that we have rules set out that look at the various parts. I'm going to move on then. That's kind of looked at all of the mandatory or the key pieces of mandatory information I wanted to talk to you about. I just want to touch very briefly on non-prepacked food, because obviously all of this information has been packaged food going to the supermarket or going to another food business, and that's fully prepackaged. If you have if you have a food product that's non-prepacked, okay, it's covered under Article 44. But the interesting thing to point out here is that Article 44, you know, describes a non-prepacked food, and it also incorporates, well, the obvious one is the food that's sold loose, so anything you go to the supermarket and it's not prepacked. But this will also bring into the equation the food that's packed on the premises from which it's sold, and also the food that's packed at the consumer's request. So you may go to the supermarket and you might find that there is something in the supermarket that's already in an individual container, so it's pre-packaged. But because that product was packed within that supermarket, that gives the derogation whereby you don't have to give all of the FIC labeling information, but obviously the key one that you do have to provide is the allergen information. And that can be given either by putting a sticker on or having an indication in front of where that food is being served to the final consumer, or that's available to the final consumer. And again, talking about product specific information, if there is any other product specific information outside of FIC, that would also be provided. So it's just important to note that a pre-packed food is one that's fully enclosed. It's something that is made on one site and it's delivered to the different premises where the consumer will purchase it. If it's packed on the premises from which it's sold, it's considered as a non-pre-packed food. So again, if we look at this label of a bread, you can see it's enclosed in a packet, and the question is, would we consider this as pre-packed food? And the answer in this case is actually no, because despite the fact that it's fully wrapped and fully enclosed, it was packed on the supermarket premises, it was baked off, and it was put into this package. And so therefore, the information should be available on site about that particular bread as to its ingredients or allergens will be available, whether it's in an allergen folder close by, or it could be on a shelf talker or a little sign in front of the food. Some other examples of the loose food, obviously we've the nice selection of the bakery and the confectionery here, and also if you have any food that's sold at a deli, that's considered non-pre-packed, and so the full rules or the full list of the rules under FIC don't apply. So in terms of the allergen declaration, you must provide that, as I said, for non-pre-packed foods. It'll be at the point of presentation or point of sale or point of supply. And for more information on that, for allergen declaration, excuse me, for loose foods, you can have a look at SI number 489 of 2014, which are our own national rules. So I just want to move on quickly just to talk about business to business sale. And if you remember at the start, I said that you might be a food business operator that supplies in bulk to another food business who are going to use your ingredients within their own recipes. And while FIC will apply in that case, there is a slight derogation in terms of the information that you must put on the external packaging. So if you have a large box that contains a bulk amount of your product, on the outside label of that bulk pack, you will be required to have the product name. So obviously to tell your customer what is in this box, a best before or use by date, so they know how long that food is going to last for. Storage instructions, so obviously they know what to do with it once they receive it into their food business, and business name and address from whom they received it. So that's all that's required as minimum information on the external packaging, but all of the information that we've looked at on our list of 11, where they apply, they must be on the commercial documents that accompany that food going to the next business. So you can see how we mentioned the obligations of the food business operator at the start, is that all of the key information, the mandatory information, must travel along the food chain to the next food business. Just very quickly on selling online, and I know the fact that a lot of businesses have turned towards selling online, and obviously this is a transaction where the customer or the consumer is not physically able to see your product or touch it in the supermarket setting. But the same rules will apply, that if I'm buying something on your website, the FIC information will apply. And in this case, and as I said, there's a number of different options through which you could be using the distance communication or the e-commerce. But all of the information that we spoke about on our list of 11, okay, and I know I just went through some of them in detail today, that must be available to the final consumer before they make the purchase. The only thing that you wouldn't have to give is the best before date or the use by date, because obviously you won't have that for the particular product at the time of purchase for the product that goes out to the consumer. But everything else, when they go on the website to purchase your food, they should be able to see the name of the product, a list of ingredients. If there's any information on QID, which is the quantitative ingredient declaration, that's giving the percentages of the main ingredients that you refer to in the name. All of that information must be on the food, must be listed on the website for the consumer to see all this before they make the purchase. And then all of the mandatory information then will be supplied when the food is supplied. And that's a form that you as the business operator can choose how you provide that information at the time of purchase. So you can see that you're joining up the dots, that the consumer now has all of the information they need to make their purchase and when they receive the food product. Just if I very quickly, and I'm conscious of the time, I just want to very quickly talk to you about nutrition labeling. Again, it's a key mandatory point. It was number 11 on our list. This is the actual nutrition table as it should be on a food label. These are the nutrients in this particular order. This is the legal minimum. Energy, fat, of which saturates, carbohydrate, of which sugars, protein and salt. Note that the salt is the declaration. Previously in the older legislation it was sodium. That shouldn't be on the label anymore. The next table I'm going to show you is the list of nutrition information that also includes the supplementary nutrients. So in red you may add these other additional nutrients, but outside of that there's nothing else can go on that nutrition declaration. That is, it's either this table here as the legal minimum, or this one, and this has to be in a linear form, in a tabular format on your label, and it's only where the space isn't available on a smaller product that you can use a linear version. And just to say that just because your label is full of other information that's not mandatory, it might be about the story of your food business or your product, that's not permitted to take up the space of the legal table of nutrition. So we shouldn't be seeing labels that have a huge amount of information on a nice to know voluntary basis, and then the nutrition declaration is a linear format. Where the space is available for mandatory information, you have to provide it as a tabular format. Again, just very quickly, and you'll find it in FIC in terms of how you must get to calculate your nutrient declaration. And again, there's a number of different options, whether you choose to have it analysed or whether you're using a set of data tables to be able to determine what the actual nutrients that you declare in your table are. Okay, and just what I'll just show you here then, you might be familiar then with some of these declarations on the label. It's typically the traffic light type labelling. And this comes in under Article 33. It's whereby the legislation allows for a voluntary front of pack information, and if you choose, it is voluntary, but if you choose to put information on the front of pack, which will be represented as one of the two screenshots there, you then must comply exactly with the rules. So it's voluntary information first off, but if you choose to use it, you must comply, and it will be either that you provide the energy only, or the energy plus fat, saturates, sugar and salt. And you can give that per 100 grams or per serving. But if you do give it per serving, you must also tell us the energy value per 100 grams. And you can see that under the colored table. So a lot of labels nowadays have this on there, but it is voluntary. And I'll talk to you a little bit about front of pack towards the end of my slides when we look at some future proposals. So, but this is just something to flag with you, that if you are using it, beware that you are complying exactly with the legislation. So I suppose there's a lot of information in there, just to flag some of the key information resources that hopefully you'll be able to use over the next coming days. Obviously, our website has a huge amount of information, and I mentioned all of the list of legislation for the various other food commodity legislation. But just to flag as well, we have our little red leaflet, which was earlier in the presentation, which summarises all of the key mandatory labelling for the generic food labelling. But just to flag with you our online e-learning modules on VIC and nutrition labelling, and they're really useful. So if you haven't been on those, I'd really recommend that you get on, because they give great examples as well, and I suppose test you out throughout. But you can join in and come back to it at any time. You don't have to work your way through it all at one go. Just then to move very briefly then, and I think this will wrap us up to move on to the questions and answers. In terms of labelling and future proposals, many of you may have seen that we have put some news items of late on our website, and also published a consultation. This is all coming out of a European farm to fork strategy that was published back in May 2020 by the European Commission, and they're really looking moving towards a more sustainable and healthy food system. And as part of the sustainable food production and sustainable food consumption, they're looking at 4 key areas of food labelling. So it's the mandatory front of pack labelling. So I mentioned to you that the front of pack at the moment is voluntary. However, these new proposals are looking to make this mandatory in the future. They're also looking to set nutrient profiles, which will mean that it will restrict the use of nutrition and health claims on certain food products that may be high in salt, sugar and fat. The proposals also look to extend origin labelling to other foods. So you'll recall that we had origin for meat cuts, and we had origin for primary ingredients of a food, but there may be other origin rules coming down the track as well. And the last one there is a proposal to revise the rules on date marking, and more specifically on the best before date, to help with food waste, because there's confusion amongst consumers as to what the best before date actually means. So I suppose this is the start of a process of discussions at EU level. The European Commission published an inception impact assessment on this whole subject. It closed at the start of February. But it's the start of a process that there will be a further 12-week online consultation later into the Q2. And I would encourage you that, if this is something that you want to maybe put your opinion in, to certainly provide the information. We will be doing, I'd imagine, news alerts that when the consultation is open for the European Commission, just to flag it. But it's really important to be able to gather everybody's feedback, all stakeholders. And just to say to you then that we have published this consultation on our website on behalf of the Department of Health, so that we could collectively see and gather the national position, so that we will be in a position going forward at the EU discussion. So again, if you haven't made a submission to this consultation on our website, I'd strongly recommend, and the links are on there, and if there's any problems on finding it, you can contact us again. But just to say, the closing date is the 25th of March for this particular consultation. And as I said, it's a pathway now to looking at key labelling areas that could potentially change in the future. So, if you have a strong view on it, I'd certainly encourage you to fill in the consultation. It's an online questionnaire on our website. So that brings me to a close. Before we go on to the questions and answers, I'm sorry, I hope I haven't run on an extra bit of time, but basically, if you need to contact us on any other specific label information, you can do so, but just that there's a raft of information, and I really encourage you to use the e-learning modules to gather a better insight into all of the mandatory labelling requirements. And just also to flag that our next webinar in the series will be on the 8th of April, again at 10 o'clock start, and this will be on starting a food business and what you need to know. So another one that would be well worth tuning into. So feel free to spread that on to any of your colleagues or your acquaintances. So that really brings us to the end, and we're ready to go, I think. And sorry if I ran on a little bit there, Emma, sorry.
Clodagh, thank you so much for a really interesting talk on food labelling. That was brilliant. And we actually have lots of questions coming in here now from the attendees, and also some that came into us before the event. Now look, we won't get to all of them today as we just have a couple of minutes left, but I'll pick out a few. And if we don't get them, if you email your question to info@fsai.ie, we'll get back to you. So we'll start off with the first one that came in here is Should provenance info on Irish whiskey labels be clear?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. That's a great one to start us off on. Yes is the answer. And I suppose what I need to do is to go back a little bit in the slides. You will remember that I talked about not misleading the consumer at the very outset, so that the consumer shouldn't be misled about any of the information, which would include provenance on spirit drinks. But also, I did mention that there's a number of other product-specific pieces of legislation. So in the spirit drinks legislation, there would be additional provisions that would say that the place of provenance shouldn't really be unclear or shouldn't mislead. So yes, that the information shouldn't mislead the consumer. However, what I would say about that is that we would have to look at the full label in its entirety to be able to see what other information, in addition to the place of provenance, might be provided on the label that might provide the consumer with more information. But certainly, you know, that's a very interesting one, and you know, it's one that you know, we certainly have to look at more in detail. It's not as clear cut, but all of the information, regardless of whether it's a spirit drink or another food product, the information has to be clear and not mislead the consumer.
Great, thanks very much, Clodagh. I'll move on to the next one here now. So as a Meals on Wheels provider, we put the allergens and date of consumption on the meals. Do we need any further information?
No, because this one will fall, Meals on Wheels, the food will be prepared on a site, and it will be then delivered to, you know, to the specific houses. So in that case, this product is loose. And the allergen information, if it's going along on the food, going to the final consumer, that's perfect, because as it falls under Article 44 as a loose food, all you really need is the allergen information, and that information can be made available, you know, prior to the, if it's whether it's on a list of different meals. But the fact that it's also being attached on to the food as it's being delivered is really good, because the consumer who gets it then will be aware if there's anything in there they need to avoid. But they don't have to have any of the rest of the mandatory information on there.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Clodagh. I think we'll have time for maybe one or two more. So the next one is, if you use honey as an ingredient, do you need to give country of origin?
No. So what we have here then is that if honey on its own was being sold in a jar, you have country of origin. What you're doing now is that you are adding honey as an ingredient to a final food. Okay, so now the final food lists honey as an ingredient, but there's always a but, and that's the good thing about food labeling, is that if the name of the food refers to honey, okay, and if then there's any indication on the label that could suggest origin of the final food, you know, that then could prompt the consumer to believe that the honey is Irish, and so you may then have to give, under the primary ingredient rules, an indication of the honey. So as a general food product, if you're just using it maybe on, say, cereals that contain honey, you just have it in the list of ingredient. But if you have a food that refers to honey and that it's associated with the final food, and you may have an origin indication of some sort on that label, you could fall within Regulation 2018-775.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Clodagh. So we'll just go to our final question now. So does Northern Ireland count as Ireland for beef, chicken, etc., or does Northern Ireland have to be specified?
Okay, so in that case, what we're talking about here is it's the origin labelling of the fresh meat, and under the specific regulation, so that was 1337 of 2013, it will indicate how you must provide the origin on there, and it's done by the member state. So it will be determined as to how you present that on the label. I suppose that then brings us into the whole question then of in terms of Brexit, and that for the purpose of food labelling, the UK is no longer the member state as such, but Northern Ireland is considered for labelling purposes as aligned with European Union legislation. So I hope I've said that in a clear way, but certainly if I didn't answer that clearly, I'd ask the person to certainly send that in to us, and we can give a more descriptive response.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much for those, Clodagh. And apologies to those of you who sent in questions that we didn't get to answer. I'm really sorry about that. But if you have a question and we didn't answer it, just email info@fsai.ie. And as I said, we'll get back to you. So look, thank you so much for taking the time to tune in this morning. And just a few things before we say goodbye. A survey will launch after this event and we'd really appreciate your feedback. It'll help us create future events suited to your needs. Also, as Clodagh mentioned, we're running another breakfast bite on food business startup, and it'll take place on the 8th of April. The event will look at hygiene requirements, traceability, training, and it'll also partly focus on mobile units and food trucks. So please subscribe to our event alerts, fsai.ie/subscribe, and you'll receive a notification as soon as registration opens. So look, that's all from us here this morning. Thanks to Clodagh for speaking and to Elaine and Anne-Marie behind the scenes. And again, thank you all for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.